Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello, and before you listen to this episode of the Sociology Show with Dr Ali Meghji, just to let you know that there was some sound issues on this episode. So a few times it sounds like it's cutting out a little bit. I've tried to do as best as I can with the editing, but it is listenable. But just apologies if there's any background sound quality, and that includes the sound of my puppy snoring in the background sometimes that you hear as well. Anyway, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on the website there, you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so firstly, I just wanted to say a big thank you to anyone that has contributed to help support the show. As you're probably aware, the Sociology Show hosting costs are all paid for by your kind donations or sponsorships. And so several people have gone to the GoFundMe page and sponsored me a little bit of money there. Some have been very generous and actually sponsored me quite a lot of money. So a big thank you to those people. So for the rest of you, if you can find the time and money to be able to perhaps help out the podcast, to give a little bit of money, then you can go to the GoFundMe page, search for the Sociology Show, and you can GoFund me as little as £5 to help towards the hosting costs. And if you can help fund me at all, then I'll send you a Sociology Show pen as just a small thank you for your kind donation. And so my guest for this episode is Ali Meghji. Ali, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cheers, Ali. Do you want to tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a lecturer in Social Inequalities over at Cambridge in the Department of Sociology. And I guess at the moment I kind of work on critical race theory and post or decolonial sociology. So I'm trying to bring those two into conversation with each other.
Great. And I'm always interested in people's background. I know you've moved around a little bit, Ali. Where did you start sociology and how did you end up at Cambridge?
Yeah, so actually I started off as a philosophy undergrad at Cambridge and quickly realized that it was incredibly abstract. And so I ended up switching into sociology partway through my undergraduate. And yeah, I guess I just fell in love with the subject because it just has this closeness to the empirical world. And it's kind of, when done properly, it realizes that the world we're studying isn't separate to the world we're living in. And I realized that so many of these complex issues need to be studied through a sociological lens. So I guess I kind of just carried on and on with it and then ended up here, I guess.
And inspirations, Ali? I'm always interested to know who your kind of inspirations within the sociological world are before we talk about your own research. Yeah,
it might be a boring one because it's probably Pierre Bourdieu. He was the first sociologist that I got really into when I was an undergraduate. Then, of course, as I went through graduate study, key figures in kind of critical race theory and decolonial thought became really important for me. So people like Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Gominda Bambra, Julian Go, W.E.B. Du Bois. But yeah, I also have a kind of like grounding in contemporary social theory. So people like Bourdieu as well that are, quite formative to me.
Bourdieu is so popular, isn't he? It's got to be the most talked about socialist. It's really important actually because it kind of once you get your head around Bourdieu, it's kind of the starting blocks for understanding everything to do with stratification, actually, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, and also kind of like not necessarily a coincidence, but something that was nice is that Bourdieu has actually got this massive anti-colonial kind of background to his work in terms of like loads of his concepts like field, habitus, capital. They were formed through the fieldwork he was doing in colonial Algeria, right? So even though when I was first introduced to him, I just saw him as someone talking about, cultural capital and so on, symbolic violence, et cetera, et cetera. Now when I'm looking at him, I'm like, oh, actually, this guy is quite important for anti-colonial thought as well. So it's a nice circle there.
And then onto your own kind of research. So you specialize in kind of critical race theory, decolonial approaches, empire and imperialism. How come? Why is that your major area of interest?
Yeah, I think that my interest in critical race theory, because critical race theory means a lot of things, but at its very foundation, it's basically about studying the structural nature of racism, right? So racism isn't about bad apples, it's about the whole roots, the soil, the fertilizer, the trees, everything. It's about everything in society. And when I started off as a grad student, I was researching the Black middle class. And that got me into critical race theory because I was kind of thinking about, when you look at all of these social class surveys in the UK, especially the kind of more quantitative stuff, and even the qualitative stuff, they have almost always exclusively or almost exclusively white samples. But the research is never framed as being about whiteness, it's framed about being about class. And then I became really interested in critical race theory because I took a group of people who were kind of economically privileged, middle class people, but still wanted to show how they're affected by systemic structural racism. So I kind of had this study of the Black middle class. And that's what got me really interested in critical race theory. But then I kind of realized that what's inside critical race theory is also a reflexive critique of sociology itself. So it looks at how sociology reproduces the inequalities which it claims to be studying. And that's then what pushed me into post and decolonial thought, because I started looking at it not just through the lens of race, but through the lens of kind of coloniality and global inequality a bit more broadly.
And so could I ask you as well, what kind of research techniques do you use?
Yeah, so I used to basically rely on qualitative methods like interviewing and ethnography. So my study of the Black middle class involved interviews with people who were identified as Black middle class, but also ethnographic observations in kind of middle class cultural spaces like art galleries, theatre, and so on. But as time's gone on, I've also started doing a bit more archival research because there's just a ton of stuff out there, and there's all of this stuff about sociology's hidden figures and stuff like that. So archival research is slowly being added to my repertoire.
Thank you. So let's talk about two of your publications. So we're going to start with your publication, Black Middle Class Britannia.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, how it got started and kind of what your key themes and ideas are as well? Yeah,
sure. So it's like what I said just now. So it kind of started from the premise that, I was looking at the research on social class. And lots of it, as great as it is, so this isn't meant to be, saying that there's no value to this literature, but quite often it was focused on very largely white samples, but it wasn't framed about being about whiteness, it was framed about being about class. So I was really interested in, what would happen if we looked at the Black middle class. Would we get the same understanding of class, or would we get something different? So there was that going on. But then also there was this thing about structural racism, right? So it was kind of like, how can you take a group of people who are privileged in many ways, right, in terms of occupation, wage, finances, and so on? How can you say that they are suffering or lower in the racial hierarchy in this structural racism? So I turned attention to cultural resources, and I looked at the unequal distribution of cultural capital across the racial hierarchy. And that essentially led me to study how traditional middle class culture and traditional middle class cultural capital and cultural spaces work to reproduce the racial hierarchy. So it was really kind of formed around the more symbolic cultural dimensions of class and how that feeds into material systems of inequality.
Could we unpack that a little bit more? I'm quite interested. You said about cultural capital. So is there a significant cultural capital difference between the white and Black middle classes?
Yeah, so I think that, and it comes back to what we were saying at the beginning about Bourdieu, right? One thing that was so good about Bourdieu's work, and that got taken up into so many different directions, is that he showed how material forms of inequality, so, economic forms of inequality, don't always have to start with economics, if that makes sense. So that's where cultural capital comes in. And when I was looking at cultural capital then, it seems like it was doing two things. On the one hand, it kind of plays a role in these material forms of inequality. So for example, if you have a degree from Cambridge, and if you have a degree from Anglia Ruskin, one form of cultural capital is valued more than the other in terms of its economic exchange. Or if you want to go even further back, if you go to a private school, so if your parents have enough money to send you to a private school and then you get trained to go to a particular university where you can then get a particular degree, you see it's like a circle and circle and a circle between economic and cultural capital. But what cultural capital also does is it allows you to claim status within a particular group. So it allows you to prove your group membership. So in the case of the middle class or the upper class, you need to have forms of cultural capital to prove that you're a member. And then once you're in that particular group, once you can prove that you're an accepted member of that group, that's then when you get the social capital. You network with particular people, which then once again feeds into economic inequality, right? Because then you can get particular jobs, you can get your children into particular occupations and so on. So that's why cultural capital was so useful for me, because I was basically looking at how, quite often the Black middle class may have a particular amount of economic status, but there's still so many barriers in terms of the unequal distribution of that cultural capital and the way that the racial hierarchy works to maintain the middle class is almost the white space, both symbolically and materially.
That's interesting. So do many Black families, for example, if they've become socially mobile or they're already middle class, do they tend not to mix and integrate and carry out the same kind of hobbies and pastimes as the white middle classes?
Yes. So what I found in my research rather was that there were kind of like three different strategies. So one of the strategies was that the Black middle class families would kind of see this traditional middle class culture as being white, but they would know that they have to kind of consume it or engage with it in order to essentially play catch up with their white colleagues, right? Or to fit in with their white colleagues. Another strategy was like a complete rejection of it. So it's white, therefore it's not really for me because I don't think that I'm represented in it, or I think that it's problematic in various ways. And they would then try to consume or emphasize consumption of what they saw as middle class cultural things, but in a way that kind of prioritized ethno-racial affinity. So they might go to, like an art exhibition at the Black Cultural Archives as opposed to the Tate Britain. Or you might read Chinua Achebe instead of, Jane Austen or something. And then there was a last group who were a minority, but still very interesting and still worth talking about. And I label them as class-minded because they don't actually like to think of themselves as being Black. They like to think of themselves as being middle class. And so they'll say like, I do middle class things, but other Black people don't do middle class things. And that's where my interest in cultural sociology kind of came in, because they were so obviously deploying racialized and class boundaries where basically the way they were defining middle class was being synonymous to whiteness, and Blackness was seen as being in opposition to middle classness, even though these people themselves were racialized as Black. So it was kind of like an interesting example of boundary work there.
That is interesting. How does that manifest itself then, Ali? How does someone kind of neglect their Blackness, if that makes sense?
Yeah. It is really interesting. And it was kind of awkward for me because, as you know, I'm not racialized as Black myself. So, you have to be very careful as a qualitative sociologist not to be reproducing stereotypes rather than, doing critical research. And the reason why I found it so kind of like important for the research was that it showed how there were particular repertoires, the cultural repertoires these people were using. And the repertoires they were using weren't just kind of picked out of thin air, but they kind of relate much more explicitly to how race and class function in British society and the meanings that we ascribe to race and class. And I think that just the very way that they would talk about, I do very middle class things and Black people don't really do these things because they don't see it as being for them, or, Black people aren't cultured to do these things. They're so blatantly reproducing dominant stereotypes of what Blackness is and what middle classness is.
Yeah.
And it helps us to realize that it isn't just an issue of all white people are bad. It's to do with these structures of meaning rather than particular individuals. And this is a perfect example of that.
So this is perhaps a difficult question then. So when people are striving to meet a certain status, is it the class or the whiteness which is kind of more important, if that kind of makes sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's almost like a question that's impossible to answer, because I think what I was trying to show in my research was that class, and I think that there's a long trajectory of British scholarship that looks at this with, Gilroy and Stuart Hall and even people like Claudia Jones and so on. And they really show that class is always an expression of race in the same way that race is quite often an expression of class. So to really kind of disentangle whiteness from middle classness becomes extremely difficult if it's possible at all. So it's a kind of a cop-out answer, but I think...
No, it makes sense. It's kind of tied together, isn't it? It definitely makes sense, yeah. So what were if we could just finish on this first publication, what were your overall kind of findings from the research, Ali?
So a lot of it was to do with kind of like, how do we study cultural capital, particularly in British society, right? So I think one of my main findings was that you can't just talk about what people consume. You have to talk about why they consume or why they think that they consume it. So if you come back to those people I was talking about, where they consume middle class culture as a means of kind of fitting in with white colleagues or playing cultural capital catch up with white colleagues, they consume exactly the same thing as those class-minded people who we were talking about, who see themselves as middle class and not black, et cetera, et cetera. So they consume the same thing, but their reasons for consuming it are completely different. And so I kind of bring attention to the phenomenology of consumption, to the need to look at why people consume what they consume. And therefore the need for qualitative research of social class and race and cultural capital rather than just big data quantitative studies. And then also just the stuff on these new cultural spaces that are popping up, especially in London, where I was basically doing most of my research, where you see these new sites of socializing for the black middle class that are also incredibly inclusive towards the black working class, right? And how that kind of affinity between a black middle class and a black working class shows a different expression of middle classness to what you see between, for example, the white middle and the white working class. So just to kind of be thinking about racialized expressions of class a bit more deeply in British society as well.
Thank you. I really like that term, cultural capital catch-up. I like that. I'm going to try and get that in a lesson.
Yeah, it was actually one of my participants who said that. So that's not my, that's not me.
I like it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ali. That's going to be the end of part one. And in part two, we're going to talk about another publication, Decolonizing Sociology.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hi, welcome back to part two of the Sociology Show. I'm talking to Dr. Ali Meghji. Ali, in part one, we talked about your research, Black Middle Class Britannia. I thought we'd talk about your publication from 2020, Decolonizing Sociology. So do you want to tell us about that one, please?
Yeah, sure. And to begin with, they seem like they're quite different. But I think retrospectively, I found a link. And the link is that in Black Middle Class Britannia, I was kind of talking about how, sociology tends to study class in a specific way that occludes the reality of the black middle class. So it wasn't, in a sense, a reflexive critique of sociology. What decolonizing sociology is it's basically using the tools of sociology to critique sociology, to situate its development in the high point of colonialism and imperialism, and to show how, in virtue of basically beginning in that period of high colonialism, sociology came to internalize a logic that it's yet to fully shake off. So it's really a kind of an exploration of how that works and what the alternatives are to the particular way that we do sociology at the moment. So
of all the subjects, sociology should not be like that, shouldn't it? If that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I say in the book, is that it's kind of ironic that decolonizing sociology is basically just taking the tools of sociology to think about itself. So, sociology says for everything else, knowledge is situated, and that no knowledge is universal, but all knowledge is specific to a particular geopolitical space and time. And yet it almost seems to discount itself from that conversation, even though it's known for, producing theories like standpoint theory and so on, where the very premise is that all knowledge is situated. So yeah, it's kind of ironic in that respect.
And same question again for this one, Ali. How did you research this one? What was your kind of methodology?
This one was mostly some archival stuff, but it was mostly just looking at what's out there, because there's just so much stuff out there on this topic. And then the publishers, Polity, were actually doing a series, a decolonizing series. And most of the time I would be kind of skeptical about whether this is just a marketing tool because it's a popular word at the moment. But they've got authors from, economics, geography, politics, and literature and all of these things. And I think that what we're all trying to do is just to show how so much knowledge production continues to be shaped by those colonial relations. And there's a ton of stuff out there that we just don't tend to teach to our undergraduates, to our graduates, that we don't tend to think about too much ourselves in the global north, just in virtue of, I guess, the way that we've been trained to think about particular things. So I guess it's really just opening up each of our own disciplines to conversations that have been excluded.
And why do you think that continues, Ali? Because everyone's very, very much aware of the issue, but it still seems to persist. So why do you think it is not changing to the degree we'd expect it to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that I tried to do with my book is I tried to write it for people that didn't really have any familiarity with the literature at all, because especially for a particular profile of, professor who have been teaching the same thing for however many decades, when they see a catchphrase, because it's basically become a catchphrase,
yeah.
And that's a whole different issue. But when I see the catchphrase of decolonizing sociology, they think, oh my God, they're coming for my head. They're going to take everything I'm teaching off the reading list. And really, once again, that's why it's ironic, is because decolonizing sociology is not really about burning books or taking anything down. It's really about, it's not about burning books, but it's about building links. So in sociology, the classic examples are everyone learns Marx, Weber, and Durkheim for introduction to sociology. Decolonizing sociology does not necessarily mean, no, you can no longer teach Marx, Weber, and Durkheim in your introduction to sociology module, but it does mean you might have to teach these people differently, right? So you might have to teach about how Marx and Weber were quite Orientalist in the way that they talked about why capitalism developed in the West but didn't develop in the rest of the world. So, Weber talks about a Protestant ethic, Marx talks about a class structure, and they both contrast that in the West with the Asiatic mode of production, with Chinese religion, with Indian religion, with Islam, in a way that doesn't actually commit to any proper historiography. So there's an Orientalism there. You might have to talk about that. You might have to talk about the fact that when Durkheim wanted to work out what we in the West, civilized people, used to be like in the past, he didn't just consult history textbooks, but he went to, research indigenous people, because he saw indigenous people as being what we used to be like in the past before we became civilized. So you have to include all of these things. You have to really situate sociology in its colonial development, but you still teach the same figures, right? And you're not saying that there's nothing useful in Marx, because that would basically erode the whole history of sociology, including decolonial sociology. So I think that, people are a bit maybe afraid of it because they misunderstand what it is. And I think that once you actually explain to people what it is, in virtue of them being sociologists, they can't really deny that it's a valuable enterprise.
Yeah, I can understand that from the point of view if you've been teaching something for 20 years, that's the way that you want to do it. So, restructuring can be difficult. And I wondered as well, do you get that kind of opposition, whenever we see something like this, the criticisms of being tokenism or trying to be woke or something like that? And where do you stand on those kind of criticisms that often incurs?
Yeah, it's interesting because in my own experience, I haven't had too much resistance because most people in my department are quite supportive of this way of thinking. The only resistance I have had is maybe a few students thought that we had done this paper just because it was trendy rather than because it was, part of my research profile. And they were questioning whether, it's prioritizing issues of race, colonialism, and empire over questions of class. But once again, it's a really good example of how a decolonial sociology isn't necessarily blind to class, because if you look at people like Stuart Hall, if you look at people like Du Bois, if you look at people like Oliver Cox, their whole kind of research profile is about tying links between capitalist exploitation in the West, so class inequality in the West, with racial inequality across the globe, and the various co-articulations of that. So once again, I think it's a great example of how even when there is resistance to it, it's quite often based on a false reading of what it really is.
So could I ask you, as a, I'm an A-level teacher myself, so I just wondered, in an ideal world, how the textbook should be restructured, as we come out with new editions for the future. Do you think things like GCSE and A-level textbooks should be reviewed, and ultimately, how should they be adapted?
Yeah, I think that'd be really good. I think that'd be really worthwhile. So I think that what's really important for a decolonial sociology or a post-colonial sociology at its really foundation is that it's relational and it's trying to build relations across time. So, the contemporary period with the historical period of colonialism, but it's also relational across space and it's relational across concepts. And maybe I won't talk about that, but basically, every single figure that we've canonized in sociology has some kind of connections to this logic of coloniality that we don't tend to talk about. We've talked about Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, but you can equally well talk about, the fact that Bourdieu's seminal theories came from his anti-colonial work in Algeria, or Foucault's seminal works on power came from his anti-imperial struggles in Tunisia. So I think that if we could revise textbooks to be thinking, and sorry if I'm talking quite far beyond my expertise because I haven't seen an A-level textbook for quite a while, but if we could revise them so that they're a lot more relational and they show that quite often we're just learning about a very narrow kind of sociology, but there are wider, more relational sociologies out there. That would be a really good way to go down that route.
Yeah, and I'm always fearful that people start to talk about this as cancel culture. It's not about cancelling something, is it? It's just about refreshing, updating.
Yeah, I see it more as an additive thing than a cancelling thing. So, so I guess in one chapter of the book, I look at what I call a sociology in conversations, and it takes inspiration from the Zapatistas who talk about basically wanting to create this climate of pluriversality of people talking to each other rather than assuming that they have some kind of epistemic authority over each other. And so what I look at is three people who we classically criticize for being Eurocentric. So I look at Marx, I look at Bourdieu, and I look at Foucault. And I look at how each of them can be embedded in a wider kind of decolonial practice. So Marx is a great example because he's so popular. And if you look at Marx, you can kind of tie Marx to so much of the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Du Bois, Fanon, Césaire, Nkrumah, all of these people, they all talk about how Marx helps us to understand capitalism, but, and as Fanon says, you need to stretch it, right? You need to stretch it slightly. And so I look at basically decolonial stretching of Marx. But in doing that, I'm not really looking at these people saying, let's do away with Marx. Marx is rubbish. No, we're looking at people who are really systematically engaging with Marxist theory and actually making it a bit more critical so that it can account for things like the relationship between the colonies and the metropoles, or that it can look at things like racial alienation, like what you see in Fanon. So it's not cancelling, it's kind of additive in that respect. And I think that that's another way that especially the mainstream media has kind of portrayed decolonizing sociology as this kind of decolonizing as this kind of wokist cancel culture. Really, it's quite far from that.
Yeah, agreed. I'm sorry if you're picking up any background noise, by the way. I've got a 9-week-old puppy on my lap and he's currently snoring.
Oh, dude. I've got a 2-year-old puppy, but she's absolutely batshit crazy.
He's snoring quite loud at the moment, so apologies if you picked up any background noise. Ali, can you tell us what you're currently working on? I believe you're working on a current publication at the moment.
Yeah, so at the moment I'm doing this kind of project that I'm calling a synergy project. So it's looking at using critical race theory in conjunction with decolonial thought to study things like populism, global capitalism, the climate crisis, and the current pandemic, because it kind of stems from this idea that we have where we kind of quite often conflate debates about decolonizing with debates about critical race and race more generally and anti-racism. Whereas if you actually look at critical race theory, it falls into one of the main traps that decolonial thought criticizes, because critical race theory kind of commits itself almost to this methodological nationalism, where it tends to study racism in particular nations bifurcated from their more transnational and historical relations, whereas decolonial thought is all about kind of tying these relations between time and space, like we discussed. So I kind of look at what happens when we play these two paradigms of thought against each other to study contemporary phenomena.
Thanks, Ali. When are you hoping to get that one out? You said it slightly delayed. Is that right?
My publisher will want me to say this year, but I think it may be a while.
Thanks, Ali. Thank you. Could I just ask you to finish off by letting us know how people can find out more about your work? I know you're on Twitter.
Yeah, so I tweet at AliM1213, and actually my academia edu profile has, I think, all of my publications open access, so you can read anything about them there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Ali. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.